back, everyone. We're here at CPAC, sitting down with James Lindsay, author of Cynical Theories. James, real pleasure having you at Crossroads.
Hey, thanks.
So, what are these cynical theories?
The cynical theories are the critical theories made mostly about identity, but we could talk about any critical theory, including even postmodernism, which isn't technically a critical theory. The idea is that they wove cynicism into theory, and that's why we took on if you see the cover of the book, it says, says critical theory, cross out critical, we put cynical. And the reason that we did that is because we claim that they are making a cynical read of whatever it is they analyze. If it's science and history, they're doing a cynical read of that. They say, science got this wrong, then it got this next thing wrong, then it got this next thing wrong. But it never says, but it got better. But it improved. It got more accurate. It never does the positive analysis. It talks about race. It says racism is the ordinary state of affairs of society. It's a very cynical thing. Progress hasn't really happened. When we had the civil rights movement, this was Derek Bell, the first critical race theorist, said, the civil rights movement didn't really advance the interests of African Americans in America. It really just took racism and hid it better. It allowed white people to advance their own interests, and it's a very cynical read of what happened through the 1960s going into the 1970s. So the cynical theories are all the different critical theories of identity, postmodernism, and even older critical theory of the Frankfurt School, as they call it.
All right, so a lot to unpack. So
lots.
I want to go into critical theory and what this is. I also want to touch on the cynical nature, because a lot of people around Marx said that he is so cynical, and actually most of what he did was just criticizing.
That's right, ruthless criticism of everything that exists. That's a Marx quote.
Ties directly into this. I want to talk to you about that, but let's start off first with what critical theory is.
So critical theory actually is a reinvention of Marx's ideas. Marx had his ideas. They attempted revolutions in the early 20th century. One of those succeeded, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. None of the others succeeded all throughout Europe. In particular, the Hungarian Revolution took and failed. Georg Lukács was kind of in charge of that. And then you had this entity called the Frankfurt School, or the Institute for Social Research. It was founded by Lukács and a handful of other guys in Frankfurt, Germany, one of whom was Max Horkheimer. Max Horkheimer was the first person to lay out what critical theory is. And what he meant is that it's Marx's critique applied to everything, ruthlessly. And the idea was to actually analyze the cultural and psychological elements, so you can read people's minds, cynically, to try to figure out why Marx's predicted revolutions weren't happening in industrial nations like Britain and Germany and the United States, but only took in a peasant society like Russia. And so the simplest summary of a critical theory, as Horkheimer laid it out in 1937 in a very famous essay that he wrote that year, is that it has to have three components. One is that it has to have a normative vision for society, an endpoint, a goal for society, which they saw as being somehow generally communist, but not specifically Marxist. So it's neo-Marxist is how it's been labeled by history. It has to have a normative vision. It has to be able to identify how the society and its systems, so it's systemic thinking, fail that normative vision, or fail to have what it takes to bring about that normative vision. And then it has to inspire what Marx called praxis, which is the fusion of putting theory into practice. And so it's theoretical driven activism. So it has to inspire social activism on behalf of bringing about that normative vision, which again for the neo-Marxists meant something like communism, but not exactly the way Marx laid it out, say in Capital or the Communist Manifesto.
Now, and so this applies to things like critical race theory, critical gender theory, and so on, right?
Right.
And how was this actually applied to these social movements?
So that actually, and this is kind of the big thing that the book presents, that Cynical Theories presents. In the 50s and 60s, kind of critical theory reached a crescendo. It still exists, there's still people doing it, but as far as a kind of intellectual social movement, it sort of reached its peak. And then it started to peter out because it got very radical, it got very, in fact, violent. It started to advocate for violence. Herbert Marcuse's repressive tolerance inspired the violence of the 1960s. People got tired of this. They weren't happy about it. And a new band of people that were trained in that line of thought, for example, Angela Davis, famous precursor to critical race theory, a black activist who's still like the lead of what the prison abolition and police abolition movement today. Angela Davis was Herbert Marcuse, her PhD student. And so she inspired this generation of black feminists in particular, queer black feminists even more in particular, to start looking at the gender theory, the feminist criticism, the black liberationist criticism that was being brought out of that critical theory school and applied to identity politics. And the critical race theory movement was born out of that. The queer theory movement was also born out of that. So these, and critical gender theory grew out of those dimensions as well. So critical theory is kind of the philosophical antecedent to all of these so-called cynical theories like critical gender theory, critical race theory, queer theory, critical fat studies, and so on.
A lot of people would look at this these days and say, well, wasn't that to fight against injustice? Wasn't this about protecting people? What is the real agenda with this? What would you tell these people?
No, I mean, nominally it is. That's the thing they say. I think that's the thing many of them believe. But the agenda is actually to tear apart the systems of Western civilization, which they, at their heart, believe that the values of Western civilization are the things that produce evil, are the things that produce fascism. Marcuse wrote that we live in a world where we're constantly in an imminent state of fascism erupting and coming into play. So we have to be ruthlessly critical. We have to censor, even pre-censor, movements from the right, as he puts it, while tolerating movements from the left. So the goal is actually to take the values of Western civilization, and the United States in particular, and question them at the very foundations, using identity politics as a tool. It is actually not a continuation of the civil rights movement, it's an inversion of the civil rights movement. Easiest way to see that is if we compare Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the student of Derek Bell, who I just mentioned, the other person credited, there are two people credited with creating critical race theory, Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw has a paragraph in her most famous and influential paper called Mapping the Margins, where she says that we have to lean into I am black versus I'm a person who happens to be black. I'm a person who happens to be black, she says, puts first their universal humanity, doesn't put first their identity, which is productive of identity politics. But that's in direct opposition. If you look back, you can go to Memphis, for example, and see the memorial there, where there's a big mural, the whole thing to the civil rights movement. The signs carried by the civil rights leaders said, I am a man. It didn't say, I am a black man. It said, I am a man. I'm like you. I'm not an identity category. Stop treating me as an identity category. So it's an inversion of those values. It's an absolute inversion of those values.
And how does cynicalism fit into this whole cynical worldview that we mentioned, Marx really embodied in a lot of his work?
Well, I mean, it depends on how far you want to go back, but it's a cynical read on the circumstances, right? So obviously life and capitalism and free societies are messy. They produce winners, they produce losers. And you can be very cynical and focus on the losers and say, look how terrible life is. Never pointing out, maybe that the entire society is rising so that even the losers of the developed world are doing much better off than people, in the middle are even doing well in places that have not developed and done better. So it's a very cynical way to read that. And then to say, oh, well, why is that happening? Well, it can't be anything that they're doing wrong. It can't be anything individual. It must be the system is screwing them over somehow. That's a very cynical read. And then when we get to specific things, like Marcuse and Horkheimer's analysis of Western civilization, they believe that the end point of, this is, for example, in the Dialectic of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer in the 40s, the end point of Western civilization is fascism. The end point of rationality, the Enlightenment rationality, the end point of that is irrationality. Total control, totalitarianism. So they had this very cynical read where they don't see the good in things, they only see the bad. Like I said with Derek Bell, the civil rights movement just created new problems for black Americans. It didn't make progress. It hid racism better, it made new problems, it made racism harder to fight, but really there was no progress. It's, again, a very cynical read on history.
Now, I want to touch with you on a bit of the origins of these things as they relate even to fascism, which is interesting. But first off, I want to talk to you about, what kind of a society does it create when it's based on this cynical focusing on the bad? What kind of society is constituted by that kind of ideology?
A sick society. I mean, there's no other way to say it. A sick society. A sick society filled with sick people. And I mean that kind of in the mental and emotional way. If you're constantly focusing on the negative and you're constantly putting the blame on systems outside of your control, psychologists call that an external locus of control, you become less and less and less emotionally and mentally capable of dealing with the challenges of life. And that then transfers into society. If you have a large proportion of the society that's constantly picking at negative things, constantly thinking of themselves in victim mentality, constantly seeing that things are out of their control, that they can't take responsibility in their lives and get somewhere, then what's going to happen is you're going to start to build a society that has to valorize, say, victimhood, and has to come up with alternative schemes rather than success or merit or individualism to reward people who are leaning into that. And so you end up with a very sick society that's honestly filled with mentally ill people. And that's a society that's going to fall apart.
Now, there's an interesting history to some of these ideas that a lot of people actually aren't even aware of. When you talk about this cynical outlook, when you talk about this focusing on the negative kind of outlook, and a lot of it goes back to Hegelianism, Hegel, which fed into Marx and actually led into Hitler as well.
That's right.
And of course, Hegel had this whole idea of, basically a cynical outlook, right? This antithesis. Can you explain that to us? We'll walk it forward.
Yeah, kind of in big picture, Hegel had this idea that everything contains its own contradiction. So we have what the world is presenting us with. We experience the world, we experience society, we experience each other, and that, he would say, presents a thesis about the world, or a thesis about whatever it is we're dialoguing about. But within that must be its contradiction, its antithesis. So that antithesis has to now be brought up. So you have this idea that the thing that you have has to be broken down, broken into pieces, so that it can then be reconstituted, as he had it, into a greater whole that would be the synthesis. This dialectical process of presenting everything that you put with its negative.
And real quick for our viewers, Hegel was Hegelianism was the leading metaphysical theory at the time of Marx.
That's
in
right.
Germany. I mean, this was not a minor thing. This was a leading metaphysical theory.
It was overwhelming at the time. He was the hugest philosophical rock star of the early 19th century in Europe, for sure.
And so you said this fed into this whole theory of kind of breaking things down. Can you explain that to us?
It depends on if you want to talk about the dialectic, where you're constantly taking everything you run into and then combining it with its negative, combining it with its negation, Aufheben in German. You're constantly trying to bring up some nitpicking way that it's not good enough, it's not right. Let's look at the other side, let's look at some negative side of it. And then to try to build something out of that which has been torn down was the Hegelian process. And he believed what this did was, to give him all the credit, he believed that perfected the ideas. And then the ideas feed into the state. And then the state feeds into what he called the Weltgeist, the world spirit. And then that gives you new ideas. And so he's got this circular process by which the state slowly becomes perfected. And the way that's got to happen is by breaking down the ideas of the old state, breaking down the self-contradictory ideas of the world. You talk about Marx. What Marx saw was, hey, let's take this out of ideas and put it into the world. Dialectical materialism, he called it. He said, stand Hegel on his head. Let's put this into the world. Let's make this material. Let's bring out the contradictions of capitalism.
And that's very Marx humor, because he inverted Hegelianism. He did to Hegelianism that same type of inversion.
Yes, exactly.
Tell us to this, though. Yeah, continue. Sorry.
No. So Marx brought it into the world, right? So he made it dialectical on materialism, as he called it, dialectical materialism, which was to do his idea was that capitalism is a huge system that's very in bed with the state that existed at the time. He was in London primarily, but all of these industrialized nations. And his idea was that there are all these contradictions in capitalism, and if you can draw those contradictions out, and you can make people who think they maybe like their lives, make them miserable about their lives, make them understand, no, you're actually getting cheated, you're actually having a bad thing. You can wake up a proletariat out of the working class. You can wake up a class-conscious group of people who will then want to have a new world, a new life. And his projection was that this late capitalism would fall into socialism, and then eventually, as Hegel's idea of the state being constantly perfected, would eventually realize the socialist state would eventually realize it doesn't need to be a state anymore. We're just communists now. And so this was Marx's interpretation of Hegel. And like you said, Marx was a student of Hegel, not directly, but he was one of the members of the so-called Young Hegelian movement under Feuerbach, who was one of the prominent young Hegelians who took Hegel's ideas and pushed them in the progressive direction immediately following Hegel's death.
And I understand there's another school that led to fascism as well. Can you tell us about this?
The idea with fascism is that you're now going to marry state power and corporate power, right? So you're going to
That sounds familiar.
yeah, public-private partnership, right? Well, let's make a
Well, yeah, but tell us about this. Yeah.
But the idea behind fascism is now that you're going to marry state and corporate power. So now you have these entities, and the idea is, well, if we just combine their powers with the state, then they can be vastly more efficient. Then they can undo many of the contradictions that are inherent, also the same contradictory process that are inherent in the opposition of state and corporate power. So if we just combine them into one thing, just imagine how much more efficient it'll be. Imagine how much better it'll be. That's sort of the mentality behind fascism. We'll have total control over the economy, and then of course good things will just happen because magic.
And so we took basically explaining the roots of these things and how they developed into current systems. And this creates an odd dialectic where two seemingly far left or far right, this far left, far right dialectic, this artificial dichotomy that's been formed and is used to create all the new social narratives we have.
That's right.
Is used to basically drive forward, again, this agenda that is built within. What is the solution to this?
Okay, so the agenda that you just actually brought up, you can talk about kind of the surface layer of what it is, like we have been, the various details. But what you have to understand is that what Hegel's philosophy brings into the world, so which Marx was then using, which the neo-Marxists, aka critical theorists, relied upon, and the postmodernists took to an art form, and then the woke of today are the intellectual inheritors of postmodernism combined with critical theory. What that gives you is a narrative-driven world, where it's all about the narrative, and then you bring up the contradictions, and you do the dialectical process. So the answer to that is actually to step out of the whirlwind. It's to step out of the cycle, to step out of the narrative, and to start saying, no, we're going to defer to objective truth. We're going to defer to fact. Show us the evidence. No more rhetoric, no more argument. Let's see the evidence. Somebody says, oh, well, this is going to happen. So-and-so's, the president is going to do X, Y, or Z. How? How is it going to happen? Let's hear the details. How are you going to make this work? By getting people to actually have to refer to actual evidence, actual processes that have workable solutions that take into account the fact that there are many competing interests that all have to be brought forth at the table, then you can force this out of a narrative-driven, almost alchemical, social environment where it's not the argument, it's the rhetoric that really matters. It's how you it's the framing of the argument that's really everything. You can bring that down to a place where now, say, if you and I have some difference, we can find some standard upon which we can both agree and then do the investigation. So it's finding some kind of agreeable standard, whether that's scientific, rigorous investigation, whether that's a superordinate identity. You and I both see ourselves as Americans versus, whatever our ethnic background is. Something that puts us on common turf, whether it's money, right? What did Thomas Sowell once say? Is capitalism only knows one color and it's green, right?
I guess just last question, seeing all of this, I guess people seeing the cynical nature, this, critical theory, these critical theory movements driving forward. A lot of them, one, are being led by the narrative now. They're falling into it, and they're not seeing the nature of it.
Right.
And a lot of people too feel threatened by it.
Yes.
I guess how would you describe the very nature of these ideas and what they really represent, and what can people do about it?
I mean, the best way to understand it is that it's an attempt to divide and conquer. And so what you have to do is understand how it is. It's a psychological, it's an emotional manipulation. It tries to keep you on your heels. It tries to drive you apart, whether it's from, one race from another, one gender from another, one sex from another, you versus your children, you versus the teachers, whatever it is. And so anywhere you can find commonality, you can find an excuse to get to know somebody different than you do, or than you are, in a genuine way, and to put all this nonsense aside, there you can do something about it. Another thing is to, if we're going to play in narratives, start speaking the other narrative and do it without apology, right? So you can tell the cynical story, for example, of the history of America. Oh, slavery, and then segregation and Jim Crow, all these horrible things. And now, the very cynical critical race theory, it's all still there. Or you can say, look at this. We put forth these ideas in the Declaration of Independence, and over many years, with much blood, sweat, tears, etc., we were able to overcome those sins of the past. So if you can frame it in terms of the positive growth, rather than the cynical, oh, it's always still bad. You also can, if we're going to be in a narrative war, put forth the positive narrative. That's something people can do.
Hey, James, real pleasure having you on Crossroads. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Josh.